All right, so here is our video lecture on gas exchange. And our essential idea for the day is that the lungs are actively ventilated. That means that we're going to use energy actively to push air in and out of the lungs. So that's the ventilation part. And then gas exchange, that CO2 to O2 flip, can occur passively, no energy needed. And a quick comment on some vocab. In not biology class, sometimes when we talk about respiration, respiring, we're talking about breathing. But here in bio, respiration is what happens in the mitochondria. And that's it. It's not what happens in air in and out of the lungs. So respiration is what happens in the mitochondria, and we do need that oxygen gas. That oxygen gas gets into our blood and is carried to the mitochondria via gas exchange in the lungs. We get the oxygen into the lungs via ventilation. So ventilation is that movement of air into and out of the lungs. Gas exchange, we're going to flip O2 and CO2 in the alveoli of the lungs. The ultimate purpose is cellular respiration, where we're going to use that oxygen as the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain so that we can make lots of ATP. So talking about this gas exchange idea and how it is passive transport. So passive transport, no energy required. We're carrying out diffusion. Diffusion is always going from a high to low concentration. So what ventilation does is it makes sure that we have a high concentration of oxygen in the lungs and then a lower concentration of CO2 in the lungs, so that the CO2 will move from the blood to the lungs and the oxygen will move to the lung from the lungs to the blood. Ventilation does require some energy because we're moving lots of muscles. Ventilation is that movement of air into and out of the lungs. Inspiration, air coming into the lungs. Expiration, air exiting the lungs, and controlled by movements of the rib cage and the diaphragm. Those movements are controlled by muscles. This is all active as opposed to passive transport, that gas exchange. We have O2 here in the lungs. It's going to diffuse into the blood. And then the CO2 in the blood is going to diffuse into the lungs. So again, passive transport and gas exchange, active ventilation. All right, so let's talk about this idea of ventilation. So ventilation is going to maintain those concentration gradients. Because we're moving air into and out of the lungs, we're going to always have more oxygen gas, a higher concentration of oxygen gas in the lungs. What's kind of cool, that oxygen gas is going to diffuse to the red blood cells, and then the capillary is going to carry those guys away. So no more oxygenated red blood cells. They're being taken back to the heart. And then the CO2 that's being dropped off by those red blood cells can then be exhaled or expired. And then because we are getting rid of that CO2, we still have a higher concentration here, a lower concentration here. And so things will always move from high to low concentration. Simple diffusion. So we have these amazing lungs that carry out our gas exchange. Not all animals do have lungs like we have lungs. So just a quick look at some of the other ways that organisms can carry out gas exchange. So little things like bugs actually carry out gas exchange directly with their surroundings. And so there are these little holes on the sides of bugs called spiracles. And the spiracles will allow the air to move in. Blood is just going to flow around those air sacs, and gas exchange can occur. So we're going to exchange those gases right with the environment, the air that's in the air sacs, the blood that kind of flows around them. Our water-based organisms like fish have gills, and blood is going to flow through the gills. The blood's going to have a higher carbon dioxide concentration. That higher carbon dioxide concentration leads to a high concentration gradient, higher to lower the Oh, I just totally drew a picture, an arrow from gills to more gills. So that CO2 in the gills is in higher concentration. It will diffuse out into the water. There's more O2 dissolved in the water, and so that higher concentration will dissolve to the gills. And then the transportation of the blood away from the gills means that the new blood coming in is high CO2 and low O2. And so once again, we are maintaining that crazy high concentration gradient. So we're going to talk here a little bit about our ventilation. So gas exchange, here we're really just looking at that idea of ventilation, moving air in and out of the lungs so that gas exchange can occur. Ventilation. Sorry, I'm not using my drawing tablet today. I'm just using the mouse. Not a fabulous mouse drawer. Anyhow, so gas exchange. Super amazing, cool groups of muscles working to get air in and out of the lungs. So muscle contractions are going to cause pressure changes in the thorax. The thorax is just our fancy word for pressure in the chest. So thorax is the chest. So we're looking at pressure changes in the chest, the thorax, and that's going to allow air to move in and out of the lungs. Different muscle groups are required for inspiration. Again, this is air coming in, like inhaling, expiration, air moving out, exhaling. Muscles only do work when they contract. So muscles are kind of cool. They can pull, they can't push. So we're going to talk about these muscles that contract. And then the relax is really just relaxing. Something else is going to have to pull because muscles cannot push. So we've got these ribs. So imagine that ribs are here. And we have muscles on the ribs. The muscles on the ribs are called intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles are on the ribs. Some of our intercostal muscles are on the outside of our ribs, and some of our intercostal muscles are on the inside of our ribs. So we're going to talk about internal intercostal muscles. And we're also going to talk about external. And again, I apologize for my lack of drawing tablet. External intercostal muscles. So when we want to, I actually should have drawn these separately. So when we want to inhale, what happens is the muscles on the outside of our ribs, the external intercostal muscles, are going to contract. That contraction on the outside of our ribs is going to pull our ribs up and away from our lungs. That makes more space and reduces the pressure on the inside of the lungs. That creates kind of like a vacuum, and air gets sucked in through the mouth, through the trachea, into the lungs. When we exhale, what happens is our internal intercostal muscles, so the muscles on the insides of our ribs, internal intercostal muscles, are going to contract. That's going to pull the ribs down closer to the lungs, and that's going to cause an increase in pressure, a decrease in volume, and air is going to get forced out of the lungs. In addition to those rib muscles, we have the diaphragm. Diaphragm's kind of cool. Most of the time, it's in this dome-like shape, which pushes up on the lungs and keeps them kind of small. Again, that decreased volume because of the increased pressure. When we inhale, the diaphragm actually contracts down. It like flattens, and that allows for more space in the lungs. More space means increased volume, decreased pressure, and that little bit of a vacuum starts to be created, and air will flow in. All of these words are the words that I just said. So take a minute and read, and then we'll talk again. So quick review. When the diaphragm contracts, and again, the diaphragm usually sits like a little dome. Lungs are here. diaphragm's here. The diaphragm pushes up on the lungs. When it contracts, it's actually going to, and here are our lungs. The diaphragm will contract down, and that makes more space in the lungs, and so air will move down into the lungs. So diaphragm contracts, pulls down. We have more volume. We have less pressure. That creates a little bit of a vacuum, and it pulls air into the lungs. Also, the external intercostal muscles. Intercostal means on the ribs. External means on the outside of the ribs. So the muscles on the outside of the ribs, external intercostal muscles, are going to contract, pulling the rib cage up and away from the lungs. Again, increasing the volume, decreasing the pressure, air goes in. When the diaphragm relaxes, that muscle is going to relax. It's going to go back into that dome shape. It's going to put more pressure on the lungs. The lungs are going to reduce the volume. Air is going to go out. The internal intercostal muscles, intercostal means rib, internal means on the inside of our ribs. These guys are going to contract, pull the ribs in on the lungs, decreasing that volume more. And if we're really working hard to get that breath out, we can also add some ab muscles. Those will contract, push on the diaphragm, which pushes even more on the lungs. We can increase the force of the air exiting the lungs. So talking about the air moving in and out of the lungs, so just a quick look at some more structures. So air is carried, we're going to go up here, mouth. Ooh, I should have been an art teacher. Whoa, that was bad. So mouth and nose. Air can go into mouth and or nose. And then it's going to go down through the larynx. The trachea. Larynx is like the voice box. Past the larynx into the trachea. This tube that goes down into the lungs. And then we're going to have a big branch. And these two first big branches are called the bronchi. So these are the bronchi. Then we're going to branch a little bit more, and we're going to branch a little bit more. Now we have little bronchi. We call those the bronchioles. Bronchioles. And then we're going to end, our bronchioles are going to end in these clusters of grape-like structures called alveoli. Alveolus is one, alveoli is many. So these lovely little grape-like structures, these alveoli, tiny little bubbles of cells that are just like little balloons, lots and lots and lots of little balloons covered in lots of capillaries so that gas exchange can occur. That blood coming from the heart, from the pulmonary arteries, is going to wash around the capillaries, get rid of that CO2, pick up some oxygen, and then that blood's going to be carried back pulmonary veins back to the heart so we can get that big pump. So what's kind of cool about these alveoli, so these bubbles here, we've got alveoli, lots of alveoli here, some more up here. So there are two kinds of cells that make up the alveoli. So two kinds of lung cells that make the alveoli, type 1 and type 2. Type 1, pneumocytes. Pneumo is kind of like pulmonary. It's related to the lungs. And type 2 pneumocytes. We also have oodles of macrophages. Macrophages aren't exactly lung cells. They're immune system cells. And their job is to gobble up pathogens. So we breathe a lot of gunk. The macrophages are going to jump on those things that we don't want to be transferring into our bloodstreams. Type 1 pneumocytes, type 2 pneumocytes. So type 1 pneumocytes, these are the guys that are actually making up the walls of the alveoli. They are the balloons themselves. Super flat and thin to allow for pretty easy diffusion of the gases, CO2 and O2. Type 2 pneumocytes, these guys are pretty cool. So their job is to make a thing called surfactant. Surfactant. Oh, I really need to get my drawing tablet back in function. Surfactant, that's an F. So surfactant is basically soap. It acts a lot like soap. It reduces the hydrogen bonding amongst water molecules that are inside the alveoli so that we do not have sticky alveoli. So again, just more words about what we just talked about. Type 1 pneumocytes, crazy, crazy thin. These guys are going to make up the walls of the alveoli, and they allow for gas exchange to occur. Most of the alveoli is made of these type 1 pneumocytes, and the type 2 type 2 pneumocytes. These are the guys that are making that surfactant that's going to prevent too much hydrogen bonding amongst the water molecules inside the alveoli. We know that hydrogen bonds form and water molecules are sticky. They like to stick to each other like little magnets. And if I had, pretend like this balloon is an alveoli, I had a bunch of water molecules in here, they would hydrogen bond to each other and the whole thing would collapse and get sticky. The walls would stick together. We definitely do not want our alveoli collapsing on themselves. And so we make the surfactant, and that's just going to prevent the alveoli from sticking to itself due to that surface tension because of the water molecules. Good. So quick question. I would love to know how many cell membranes must an oxygen gas molecule pass through to get from the inside of one of the alveoli to the hemoglobin that's inside an erythrocyte, which is a fancy word for a red blood cell. So take a gander at the picture. Think about how many membranes need to be crossed. And I'm going to tell you the answer in 5 seconds. And I'm telling you the answer in 5 seconds because the answer is 5. So these oxygen gas molecules, they're going to have to get across this side of the type 1 pneumocyte of the alveoli. And then we have to get through the other side, that next membrane of the type 1 pneumocyte of the alveoli. But then we need to get in and out of the capillaries. We're going to have one membrane to get into one side of the capillary, one membrane to get out of the other side of the wall of the capillary. And then our last membrane, we are going to have to get into the red blood cell because that's where the hemoglobin is. Good. So now that we pretty much understand this idea of ventilation and gas exchange, we're going to talk about when it gets broken. So gas exchange gone awry. Lung cancer is definitely a problem that is going to impact our ability to exchange gases. Things that can lead to lung cancer, some of us just have genetics that lead to an increased chance of lung cancer. Sometimes we breathe stuff in the air, carcinogens in the air. Sometimes we're exposed to nasty stuff like radon. Less so now, but back in the 60s, we had a lot of radon, especially in basements in the Northeast. But one of our biggest paths to lung cancer is smoking. Don't do it, my friends. It's really, really bad for us. So these are healthy lungs and these are smoker lungs. Not good. Don't do it. Other diseases that we can, diseases that impact our ability to exchange gas. So COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it is going to obstruct our lungs. So something, tissue damage or inflammation, something is making it very hard for us to get the air in and out of the lungs. Emphysema is another disease of the lungs where we are just damaging that lung tissue. The symptoms of these disorders, shortness of breath, anemia. Anemia is a lack of oxygen in the blood. If I can't get the oxygen out of the lungs into the blood because my lungs are broken, of course, we're going to have too little oxygen in our blood. These cost about $32 billion every year here in the United States. Just the combination of the cost of people missing work, and the cost of getting health care for those problems. Don't smoke. In case I didn't see it already, if I didn't see it, if I didn't say it, if I haven't said it already, please don't do it. It's so bad for you. So back to this idea of emphysema, some of the causes and the treatment. So it is by far caused mostly by cigarette smoking. Don't do it. About 2% of the US population is diagnosed with emphysema, mostly because they were smoking cigarettes. Don't do it. How do we fix emphysema? We don't smoke. There are some drug therapies. We can use bronchodilators that are going to reduce the inflammation in the lungs, open up those lung passages a little bit. And then sometimes people just have to be on oxygen therapy. They carry oxygen tanks around with them everywhere. The more oxygen, the higher the concentration of oxygen that they're inhaling, the easier it is for their bodies to transfer that oxygen into their blood. Asthma is another problem related to gas exchange. So when someone's having an asthma attack, it's all about inflammation. And so the trachea, the bronchioles, instead of being nice and open with lots of space for gas to move, instead they start to swell shut. And so there's only this tiny little space where air can move in and out. And we also have this increase in mucus production. So not only do these guys close down, but they also start to fill with mucus. So just a terrible feeling, like you can't breathe, a little bit like you're drowning, but not underwater. Lots of things that can lead to asthma. Some of us just have those genes that make us more prone to asthma. And there are some environmental things that can trigger those attacks, allergies, pollution, sometimes having some other respiratory illness. If you've got the flu or RSV, that could lead to asthma attacks. Some of us, if we're breathing quickly because of physical activity or adrenaline, emotions, and stress is getting to us, these can all lead to some asthma attacks. Treatment, the best thing is to prevent it, to kind of like know what your triggers are and avoid those. And then people can also have their inhalers. And so they're just steroid medicines that will reduce the inflammation on the insides of their lungs so that they can breathe again. So we'll talk a little bit of extra stuff, things that won't be on our test, but are kind of cool related to carrying oxygen around the blood. So what's an amazing thing. So hemoglobin is the molecule in red blood cells that carries oxygen gas. They've got these super cool heme groups that have iron in them. And this is really where the oxygen is going to stick. What's kind of cool about fetal hemoglobin, so the hemoglobin in the blood of a fetus compared to adult hemoglobin, for example, in the blood of a pregnant woman. So fetal hemoglobin actually has a stronger grab on the oxygen. So mom's blood's flowing through the body at this rate of saturation, and the fetus's hemoglobin totally can rip that oxygen right away from mom's blood and send it to the fetus instead of to mom. Similarly, so hemoglobin is what carries the oxygen around our blood. Myoglobin is a molecule that's similar, that's in muscles. And so we've got oxygen here. The saturation curve of myoglobin is stronger. And so the oxygen in the blood can totally be ripped away by the muscle cells. But that's good because I actually want the oxygen to get to the muscles where all of my mitochondria need to make that ATP so that my muscles can do things like breathe. And here's just another look at the fetal hemoglobin, maternal hemoglobin. So all of this transfer of oxygen is going to take place in the placenta. So we've got mom's bloods and fetal umbilical cord vessels. And that gas exchange can just occur because the fetal hemoglobin is like, give me that oxygen. It's pretty amazing. So how do we get that CO2 away from the body and to the lungs so that we can exhale it. So there are a couple different ways that we can carry the CO2 around the body. One, that CO2 can just be dissolved in the plasma. The plasma is the water version of the blood. We can also combine the CO2 with water. So CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid. And when I have too much carbon dioxide in my blood, I have a lot of this carbonic acid, and that's going to trigger my medulla to know that my blood is too acidic, and we breathe faster to get this out. And then also that hemoglobin can also grab onto some CO2. But of course, the hemoglobin would much rather grab onto the oxygen. So it'll let go of the CO2 pretty quick so that we can get that oxygen instead. And we mentioned this last class just a little bit, talking about changing heart rate. So there are chemoreceptors, receptors that are sensitive to chemicals that are related to pH, acidity, in the medulla oblongata, which is like part of the brain stem of the brain. And if the pH is too high, that should not say high, that should say low. The pH is too high is wrong. Make sure you change that to low. The acidity is too high, but the pH is too low. Because we have too much CO2 in the blood, the medulla is going to send some messages to that SA node in the heart to increase heart rate. We're going to breathe a little bit faster, and that'll get that CO2 out so that our pH will go back up to a less acidic space. All right, so quick question. Why do we breathe faster when we exercise? And another quick question. So like Olympic trainers, so elite athletes will train at very high elevations. Our U.S. Olympic Training Center is in Colorado Springs, which is 6,000 feet above sea level. Why? Why is that a benefit? And also, what happened to my parentheses and question mark? So noodle on it. Why do we breathe faster when we exercise? Because we're making more CO2. And if I have more CO2, I need to breathe faster to get that CO2 out. Why do elite athletes train at very high elevations? Because there's less oxygen. This is crazy cool. So because there's less oxygen gas at those higher elevations, the red blood cells of these athletes actually learn to accommodate that less amount of oxygen. More red blood cells will be made so that they can grab onto more of that oxygen because there's less available to grab onto. So we work a little harder to grab that oxygen. But what's kind of cool is that increase in red blood cell doesn't go away right away. And so when you go back to a place that you have regular oxygen, but you've got extra red blood cells, you can seriously pack in some huge amounts of oxygen and get those mitochondria making amazing amounts of ATP. And again, we looked at this a little bit before, just this idea of hemoglobin's here, myoglobin on the muscle is here. And so the myoglobin can pull the oxygen off of the red blood cells pretty easily. So crazy, crazy things that humans sometimes do. And we're going to call it a night, my friends. So I mentioned those elite athletes like to work out at high elevations so that they produce more red blood cells so that they can have an increase in oxygen transport. More oxygen to the mitochondria means more ATP, means more energy to compete. So some time ago, a couple years ago, 2019, people thought it would be an awesome idea to just get some fun blood transfusions just to feel young. Because if I could get let me find the name of the company, Ambrosia. Ambrosia is the name of the company. So young people would get paid to donate blood, and then old people would pay to get the young people blood because there was, more red blood cells and it made us feel energetic or something. But the FDA said that's a bad idea, and then the FDA said not just that it was a bad idea, but it was an illegal idea. So that was a thing for a very short time in 2019. Uh, yeah, people do crazy things to try to feel young. And that, my friends, is the end of our video lecture on gas exchange. And I'll see you in class pretty soon.